Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, August 28th, 2017. A little echo today? Okay, I hadn't even started talking before we had problems here. Well, very interesting. We'll see if we can adjust the mic here today. We made a couple of changes, but everything, well, all right, 5 by 5. At least you're receiving me. Yes, okay. A couple of changes, just still trying to tweak the sound so that we get everything just so. A little bit of advice on the side from all sorts of folks chiming in, from Justice to Scott Anderson to listeners like you who help support the show. Thanks very much. No echo effect on the vocals. I wonder what was doing the echo on the music, if anything. I don't know. We'll straighten that one out. Plenty of time for that later once we get through the morning's outrages and the weekend craziness and Houston being underwater. Daily Coast Radio, though, is live now, as we are reminded ably by Bill in Portland, Maine, who tells us, Kagro X, that's me, David Waldman, wonders today, what will fall harder today, Texas rain or Trump bullcrap? It is coming down thick, fast, and furious. It's raining cats and dogs and bullcrap, of course, and amazing pictures, of course, coming out of Houston, not only the amount of rain that they have there, which Trump will remind you is it's the most fantastic, most largest amount of rain Houston has ever seen under my administration. Thank you very much. Probably taking credit for that one. Big news also today, which I feel like we have heard before. Donald Trump desperately seeking a Moscow hotel deal, this time during the presidential election. He will, of course, and his fans will point out, well, at the time when it finally rolled around after the election, at which he said, I have no deals, I got nothing to do with Russia, I have no Russian deals in the works, I never have. It's true, he never had. He never got any of those things worked out, but lots more details, lots more reason to talk about. Felix Sater is going to be in the news today. We'll pick that up, no doubt. And, check in on how things are going. Greg Dworkin, of course, has a great roundup of news stories from the weekend. I usually say a raft of stories. I didn't want to tease anybody who's in trouble with floodwaters. But it's pretty amazing what's happening down in Houston. And Trump now, I guess, faces the test. Will he lose an American city to flooding and a hurricane the way that George W. Bush did? And they spent 8 years trying to find Obama's Katrina. And, we're about 32 weeks in here. We may be watching what I guess would be Trump's Ekaterina, I guess, is how they would describe it in Russian. It's been a weird weekend. All right, let's see. We got, let me just make sure that I've got all of Greg's stories lined up. Yeah, there's 14 of them in there. So we have a serious day ahead of us. Let's see. Also, of course, by the time we wrapped up the show, this is how fast the news cycle is with this guy. Friday morning, we had no official indication, though we had warning ahead of time that Trump was contemplating pardoning ex-sheriff, now Joe Arpaio. And do we say Arpaio or Arpaio? What does he say? We'll say the opposite of what he says, just to add a little insult to all of this. But he's been pardoned of his federal offenses, and remember, that's all he can be pardoned of by the President of the United States. And there's all sorts of possibilities. Well, I mean, maybe not state charges in Arizona, where he actually resides. They sort of, in many ways, love and protect their idiot racist sheriff. But it does, of course, open him up to civil suit, which is nice, but not exactly the same thing as being subject to federal criminal penalties. He was found in criminal contempt of court for defying court orders. Basically, federal court saying, hey, you're racist, and if you continue doing this racist stuff, you will be in big, big trouble. And Trump says, no, you won't. I will free you from that trouble. So there's no clearer sign that you can possibly make. all sorts of complaints, of course, about the process by which the pardon was offered, but some very thoughtful writing that I think we can share later on about how, well, for once, we ought not to get distracted by process. Although there is a process story there, generally speaking, one of the ways that you protect against the abuse of the pardon power is you follow the norms and guidelines established by the Department of Justice in seeking pardons, and you're not supposed to hand them out before anybody begins their jail sentence, their prison sentence, and just make sure that people don't suffer the consequences of their crimes. And there's supposed to be some contrition that goes along with it. And, of course, there is the legal effect that people say once you accept a pardon, it would only be effective if you were acknowledging your guilt in that crime. You can't be pardoned of crimes you didn't commit, but that's a formality of construction. Of course, you can accept a pardon at any time, and if you decide not to admit that you were guilty, you're no less free from prison as a pardoned individual. So that doesn't hold a great deal of weight with me. But there's some excellent analysis out there of the process and some even better analysis about, well, for once, let's just focus on the substance of things here. Yes, there were some procedural abuses in issuing this pardon, but worse than that, you issued a pardon to a horrible, horrible, undeserving person who is in fact a criminal and deserves to spend a considerable amount of time in jail, and that's bad all by itself, and you needn't look any further than that. But I will help you look further so you can find out exactly why it is that Joe Arpaio is so terrible. There's a long list of things, and as much as you may have heard about him, very often you'll find that there's still one more thing that will surprise you. Maybe Greg knows some of them. He's here with us this morning. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Hey, good morning. You know, one of the local alt dailies, you know, one of the
the good kind
Phoenix
of
News Now, I think it was,
yes.
Did a nice tweet storm on all the things that Joe Arpaio had done over the years.
Yeah, that sort of became the standard for the weekend.
Yes. But of course, there's two big stories. One, of course, is the hurricane, and the other is the Arpaio pardon, which in and of itself, in addition to floods and of biblical proportion, was its own firestorm. So
yes.
There's a lot to this. Let me start with a big picture sort of a compilation here.
Because it's all big in Texas.
Everything is. But let's look at the Julia Azari, political scientist. She's got a nice piece in 538 called Trump is a 19th century president facing a 21st century problems. And points out in a lot of ways in terms of how he acts. It's similar, not exact, but similar to some of the non-entities that you may remember from history books, but really don't remember exactly what they did. You know, Zachary Taylor, Franklin Pierce, you know, name their greatest accomplishments. Well, they got to be president, right?
Zachary Taylor had children very old, didn't he? Was it Taylor?
Well, you know, that's the kind of thing you have to go back and scratch your head and say, see if I remember that.
Yeah, Tyler.
Abraham Lincoln that you could just know is, oh my gosh, that's a specific, you know, leader that I can remember. The rest is kind of non-entities.
James
and
K.
part of the reason for getting exactly what Taylor may or may not have done and Pierce may or may not have done, in those days, the presidency was small and Congress was big.
Yes.
It really wasn't until after the Civil War and the 20th century that things changed. And in those days, whenever you had a problem, the president would say, gee, that looks like a problem. Congress, fix it.
Yes.
Which is, in a way, what Trump has been doing with all of this stuff. I have a fantastic plan for health care. Ryan, come up with something. I have a fantastic plan to get rid of ISIS. I'm smarter than the general. Generals, come up with something.
Yeah, do the generals remember when he said that? I wonder about that.
I think they do. I don't think you forget stuff like that.
I hope not. Shouldn't be a general if you do.
But you know, it's just what was okay then is not what's required now. And, you know, of course, one of the big differences is a requirement for moral leadership.
Oh, wow.
which this guy doesn't come up with very often. So that's the bigger picture that I see a lot of this stuff.
Okay.
And then you go back to exactly what happened. Now we have this incredible but predictable situation in Houston with flooding. It's the most flooding anybody's ever seen, but there's plenty of stories one can uncover quite easily, Grist and other places talking about how Houston was prone to this.
Yes.
And how easy it is for Houston to flood. And in fact, there's even some nuance about the response that Houston is doing right now. Don't forget they're in the middle of a disaster, and they're not even at disaster recovery, because apparently what's happening is the storm is going to make its way a little bit back to the Gulf, not to get hurricane strength, but feed a little bit more, and it's going to be sitting there stalled and dumping just as much rain from the next 2 days onward than it has up until now. And that's total going to be pretty much what Houston sees in a year. And it can't handle it. And there's 300,000, 280,000 people without power. There's already been 2,000 to 3,000 high water rescues. And the city really cannot cope with what's going on there, understandably because of the size and scope of what's going on. But decisions were made. And whereas nobody wants to talk about it now, they're certainly going to be talked about afterwards. Things like, do you evacuate? Do you not evacuate? Not a simple decision. It was such a simple decision that the mayor said stay put, while the governor said maybe you should get out of there.
Yeah.
But they're on the same page now, which is it's not the right time to talk about this.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, we should wait for, say, the rain to stop and people to be made safe.
And that's okay.
Yes.
That's not an unreasonable thing to think.
I am okay with that.
On the other hand, one also has to keep in mind that if you're poor, and there's a lot of people in Houston who are, it's not so easy to evacuate. Where do you evacuate to? How do you do it? How do you pay for where you're going? And so on and so forth. Plus, about 8 or 9 years ago with Hurricane Rita, there was a very poorly planned evacuation that was made mandatory, and people on the road actually wound up dying because of the traffic jams. More people died in the traffic jams trying to get out of Houston than actually in the storm.
Okay, so that would create some sensitivity, yes.
So they weren't rushing to try to tell people to get out of there. As of this morning, however, there are certain areas that are now under mandatory evacuation.
Okay, sensible enough.
Yeah, the low-lying areas, but all of Houston is low-lying, and so they're starting to see floods in places that they never really expected to before. And one could reasonably ask the question, not now because the rain is falling, but in a few days, of if they're evacuating now, why didn't they evacuate before?
Always a question, and there are always multiple answers to why people didn't evacuate, and each one needs to be treated individually, and the press doesn't do that really well. It's hard to do.
I'm just bringing it up because it's a really complex situation. It's a complex situation now. It's not in recovery yet because they're still in the midst of the disaster. And although the storm hit the coast of the U.S. over the weekend, Friday, Saturday, it's still going on. It's going to be going on until Wednesday, Thursday. And as a matter of fact, the storm is going to drift off into Louisiana, and there's going to be flooding there as well. So this is a very slow developing disaster in terms of flooding. And that's the basic situation. Now, one of the hallmarks or golden cardinal rules in disaster communication, which is something I know a bit about, is you don't, at the beginning of a disaster, an unfolding one, particularly one where you're not really sure what's happening, you don't congratulate yourself on what a good job you're doing.
No? Okay.
Heck of a job, Brownie. Everybody remembers that, even if they remember nothing else about Katrina.
Yeah, that's one of the highlights, or lowlights as it might be.
So Sunday morning, Trump gets on Twitter, which is something he's prone to do.
Yes.
And there's this disaster going on. And what's his first tweet?
I'm
a great
awesome.
book by a great guy, highly recommended, David A. Clark Jr., available on Amazon and your favorite bookseller.
He's the two worst sheriffs in history.
Yeah, and more on that too. But
And more on,
that in fact was his early morning tweet.
Yeah.
And Jim Roberts, New York City Jim, for example, captured it. I have all this in the pundit roundup. Amidst vast destruction in Texas, the first public thing Trump did today was endorse a book by Sheriff Clark.
Yeah, little business.
And then he gets to the storm, and he does tweet a little bit about the storm. And what does he say? Wow. Now experts are calling Harvey a once-in-500-year flood. We have an all-out effort going, and going well. And he tweeted another bunch that sort of went with that, talking about how excited he was about how big a storm this was.
Yeah, they bring only the best storms for me.
Right. Now, that's important for a couple of different reasons. Forget the childlike approach to this. If things go well, it's to his credit, and if things don't go well, it's because it was a historic storm that nobody, of course, could have predicted. No one could have predicted these towers would come down.
Right.
So, he's got that part of the disaster management communication down pat. That he's very good at, protecting himself. But, what is he doing in regard to this particular storm? He's going to be visiting Texas. Luckily, he won't be going to Houston. He's going to be going inland. It might be a little bit too soon for that. The FEMA folks are on the ground coping with a disaster that they're only, now realizing in terms of how bad things are. There's dams in Houston that need to be unloaded so that they don't bust, like what happened in New Orleans. That only leaves more water for somewhere else. And we're going to be reading about this for a long time. What's also remarkable is the heroism of ordinary folks, not the president, but ordinary folks who are out in boats rescuing neighbors. And whenever you have a disaster like this, it's always, as Preet Bharara tweeted, heartening to see ordinary people, stand up and do what needs to be done to the extent that they can. If you want to help, do not send goods, send money.
All right.
Traditional American Red Cross is okay. Charity Navigator has a list of charities, local charities that you could consider sending to. And that's basically what's the story there in Houston. So a lot more there. And again, the response, let me just give you an idea. Also in the pundit roundup, August 27th, 5:43 a.m., City of Houston official Twitter feed wrote 9/11 services at capacity. If you can shelter in place, do so. A few inches in your home is not imminent danger. Only call if in imminent danger. If you click on that tweet and look at the responses, they're just heartbreaking. Here I am, here's my number, I'm stuck, this isn't inches, this is feet, help, get me out, that kind of thing.
Right.
And there were limited services. There was only so much that people could do. So, they were advising people, don't go up to the attic, at least not if you don't have an axe, because you're going to have to break through the roof. Get on the roof of your house, not the attic. In terms of what's happening, I saw a CNN reporter who was reporting in a boat about some of the flooding, who went past a house where people were stuck. So they put the microphone down, and not the cameras, and rescued folks.
Yes, we know they put the microphones down because they didn't put the cameras down. That's how you can see it.
Right.
And
that effort was led by some Texas A&M students.
Oh.
Who were out there guiding the reporters around in terms of what's going on and helping with rescue. So, again, a lot of heroic stuff going on. I'm well familiar with what do you do when you're trying to report stuff. That happened here in Newtown with some of the reporters and photographers actually also being EMS people. So you got to put down one hat and put on the other when the need arises. And we saw that in Houston, and it's really a remarkable thing. Now, other part of it, politics. We remember Sandy, and there were a number of votes. I think I listed them for you somewhere on the roundup that I gave you, of people, including about 20 Texas congressmen, who did not vote for Sandy relief.
Yes.
And what will we do? Because what's happening is that, again, even though the storm isn't over yet, there's going to be bills for Houston relief, and Democrats will pay, and we will vote yes, even though they voted no. But by the way, it's also going to throw off, because these are complicated bills. They have a lot of money. Some Republicans will argue for trade-offs and pay-fors in other areas, so it's never simple. And that will likely throw off an already arduous and tough schedule to make sure that the debt ceiling gets raised and a bunch of other stuff gets done in September. And so there's even more of a mess in Congress now in terms of trying to get stuff done because this is going to take precedence.
Yes. It's going to be an interesting thing to watch. And yeah, Democrats won't do, there's a strong temptation to try to punish, but it's
right.
Really.
We're not going to do it. It's not who we are.
Yeah, that's unlikely. All right, let's see. I have to see if I can fix an echo for you on the fly. Let's see if this will work. All right. Well, you and I keep going as there's nothing for you to change unless you're standing in a bottom of a well or anything.
Right. I'm broadcasting from the bottom of a stairwell. That sounds better.
Oh, okay.
By the way, whatever you just did.
All right. Well, I try. We have
Thank you for taking that bucket off the top of your head.
All right. Well, let's see if that works for people. A lot of complaints that your sound is not as good as usual. So, I had made some changes on my own sound.
Can you hear me now?
I think are okay. You're fine. And, if you think you sound better, we'll go with that for the next few minutes until more people complain.
Right. So, why America still hasn't learned the lessons of Katrina? Because it's really hard to move a place that's basically built on a lowland.
Yes. That's not an easy thing to do. We got to start talking about that, of course.
And by the way, let's mention some other Trump tweets from yesterday. With Mexico being one of the highest crime nations in the world, we must have the wall. Mexico will pay for it through reimbursement or other.
Other.
Yeah.
Oh.
And by the way, this is all in the middle of the hurricane, right? Because this is the most important.
Yes, I did think that there was some chance that he might be able to get Mexico to pay for the wall if he rebranded it as a dam. That might work.
Also, I will be going to a wonderful state, Missouri, that I won by a lot in 16. Dem CM is opposed to big tax cuts. Republican will win S.
S?
I think he meant Senate.
Oh,
Maybe he meant safety. Maybe CM is Claire McCaskill. Maybe not. It's hard to know. It could be coordination managers. You can never tell with Trump.
Well, I hope they win S. I mean,
yeah.
Jack S, not a single one.
So anyway, so you have all of that going down.
Weird.
And again, there's some fascinating
it is S.
stories here about how Trump is navigating being in the White House that he never really wanted and doesn't really know what to do with. For example, there was a story in Axios this morning about a conversation that he had purportedly with his chief of staff about tariffs.
Oh.
Trump addressing Kelly says, John, you haven't been in a trade discussion before, so I want to share with you my views. For the last 6 months, the same group of geniuses comes in here all the time, and I tell them tariffs. I want tariffs. And what do?
Yes.
They bring me IP. I can't put a tariff on IP.
Okay. He does P, though.
Most in the room understand that the president can, in fact, use tariffs to combat Chinese IP theft. China's laughing at us, Trump added. Laughing. Kelly responded, yes, sir, I understand. You want tariffs. And that goes with the New York Times story. You treat me like a baby. Am I like a baby to you? I sit there like a little baby and watch TV and you talk to me. That was Donald Trump to Paul Manafort as quoted in Devil's Bargain by Joshua Green.
Yes, that was a factual statement. He did.
Why does Mr. Trump's team treat him like a kid? He's the president of the United States and he says, you're not. He lives in the White House where he gets 2 scoops of ice cream instead of 1 for dessert. He's commander-in-chief eating the most beautiful piece of chocolate cake with the Chinese president while he fires missiles at Syria. As he told the Russians, people brief me on great intel every day with lots of pictures and tweet-length sentences. He has a beautiful Twitter account.
Why? Why treat him like a child?
And I say all of that because, again, you'll see the media attempt to normalize Trump, pretend he's president. His trip to Texas will be covered as if, somehow relief from Washington is finally landing. And, of course, none of it's true. He does have a competent FEMA person. It turns out the person who's in charge of FEMA is an experienced disaster manager from Alabama, has some odd views on who should pay for what. He thinks the state should pay for everything, not the federal government. So it'll be very interesting to see what he does and where he is in regard to the relief package that comes from Washington. However, right now he's got his hands full just trying to deal with what's there. So at least there's this is not a Michael Brown situation. Heck of a job, Brownie. This guy actually has some experience. So that's a plus for Texas. And the governor of Texas is doing everything possible to prop up Trump and say that we're getting everything we need from Washington. And again, it's kind of early in the whole process to really say that anything is going well because it's all developing.
Yeah.
And that's about all I have to say about the hurricane. You got any questions?
No, I haven't got any questions about it. There's not too much that, we've always had a low bar for Trump. And really, the test for him with the media is likely going to be, as long as he doesn't do anything that is obvious and it's, in the way it screwed things, if he doesn't make things worse, then he'll be presidential in the way he deals with this thing, even if he spends all his time tweeting about other garbage. But, and he has done that. And someone else pointed out, by the way, in all of his FEMA briefings, he's wearing the USA hats that he sells for $40 a pop on his website. So it's product placement as well. So he's multitasking. That's good. But so far he hasn't, sent anybody any anchors. So that's good.
Yeah, all of this while the Russia probe closes in on him, and a big story in the Washington Post with a rework of some old news at a time that he was insisting that he had no contact with Russia whatsoever.
Yes.
He was trying to make a deal for a big Trump Tower in Moscow.
Yeah, and telling everybody he had no deals later on. We do have a couple of seconds to wind into our break here, but it is coming up. We're definitely going to have to discuss that one. Big topic for the late weekend, but we will bring that one up on the other side of our first 2-minute break coming up right now. We'll be back in just a few. All right, we are back from our break with more Kagro in the Morning on Netroots Radio. There's our exciting music. We were at a little lull in the music. So people won't know how exciting it is to come back to the Kagro in the Morning show. Okay, we are back. All right, Greg, let's see. You were just reminding us before the break of the Trump Tower Moscow story, which we may or may not pick up at this point, but...
Right. Well, the big thing there really is that Trump claimed not to have any relations whatsoever and no deals with Moscow at a time that he was actually making deals. And those deals were in the works until late January 2016. So at the time, I think Jeb Bush was still in the running to give you an idea of how early/late it was in the process. Yes. But, clearly he had his finger in a lot of different things. And to me, you talked about product placement with the hat. It's all about money. The whole reason for running for president was about money. And unfortunately, he accidentally won, and now he's trying to figure out what to do about it.
I think I can still make money with this if I win. And, as far as the Moscow hotel goes, I'm sure the excuse is, I was still conducting business, and I didn't really... it wasn't clear I was going to win the biggest victory ever at that point. So I was holding on.
Well, again, what's the big deal about that? Well, if it turns out if a lot of the information there is coming because Felix Sater flips, that's the Moscow financier that was working with Trump on a lot of these issues, and other stories about putting pressure on Manafort and, of course, Flynn. It all may come down to just how much money laundering and funny money was going back and forth between Moscow and Trump properties. So that's why it's all interesting.
Well, yeah, it is, because more or less all the money going into Trump or the Trump organization was coming from Moscow, with the exception of a couple much smaller dues payments for Mar-a-Lago coming out of Florida. That's where the money comes from for him. They've said as much.
Yeah, Don Jr. said as much.
Yes.
Again, I can never remember which one is the dumb one, but one of them said, that's what's going on. What's the problem? You got a problem with that? It changes
from day to day. Saturday Night Live says Eric is the dumb one, but neither one of them is all that smart.
So the topic I do want to talk about is Joe Arpaio, and I have this fascinating tie-in between Arpaio and Sheriff Clark that was put together by J.J. McNabb.
Oh, yes.
Who studies 3%ers and part of the anti-government extremism sovereign nation movement.
Yes, they're worse than 1%ers.
She says the pardon of Joe Arpaio is wrong. The guy violated the Fourth Amendment repeatedly and shat on our judicial system.
Oh.
But there's another problem. And that is, I think past term is okay on the radio.
Yeah.
Anti-government extremist movement is a well-known constitutional sheriff, a subgroup of the overall anti-government extremist or AGE movement. He's a name in the world that spawned Bundy militias, the recent bombing attempt in Oklahoma City, McVeigh, the militants in Charlottesville, etc. Trump invited two constitutional sheriffs to speak at the Republican National Convention, Arpaio and Sheriff Clark. While the press focused on Trump's white supremacy dog whistles, he was using a bullhorn to attract a much larger and more dangerous group. And by the way, as an aside, I have another tweet storm from her that I'm not going to do, but pointing out that the smaller white extremist movement and white supremacist movement is different from, but unfortunately now starting to be allied with the much, much larger anti-government movement, who was well armed and organized into militias.
Yes.
And you saw the tie-in in Charlottesville where you had militias protecting the Nazis. So she says earlier this week, a federal jury couldn't convict 4 Bundy militants who committed their crimes on camera and bragged about it on social media. To be honest, I was relieved. There's a good chance Trump is going to pardon the Bundy men and their supporters. Last night, Arpaio thanked Roger Stone for influencing Trump on his behalf. Stone's been working on a similar pardon deal for the Bundy standoff participants. A jury verdict exonerating people who aim guns at federal employees is bad and that it invigorates the violent efforts. A presidential pardon is far worse.
Yes.
It tells these guys it's their patriotic duty to ignore the courts and enforce laws at gunpoint. And if you've been reading my Twitter feed for any time, you've seen just how bizarre the legal beliefs of the AGE movement are. And it's all part of the sovereign nation stuff. For example, many anti-government extremists, AGE members, believe Obama's a Kenyan who has committed treason and should be killed. Another example, they believe that the sheriff is the highest law enforcement officer in the land because he's elected.
Okay.
Roughly 140 out of 3,200 county sheriffs have fallen for this AGE myth, which puts those sheriffs who haven't at risk of being killed. As I've written in other threads, these extremists tend to be very pro-law enforcement as long as the cops are doing what they want. When cops don't do what they want, it's considered a treasonous violation of the cop's oath of office, punishment for which is death.
Well, yeah, that's a little self-reinforcing delusion. Okay.
By pardoning Arpaio's last tweet, this is the dark underbelly that Trump is telling to rise up. And remember, Sheriff Clark is one of these constitutional sheriffs.
Yes, which, again, to be clear, is a name you give yourself because it sounds good.
Right, just like sovereign, I'm a sovereign citizen.
Yeah.
What does that mean? It only means something to you. I don't think it has the force of law in actual, real courts.
There's a lot of them. I mean, not a small number, 140 such sheriffs. But although they say sheriffs that don't declare themselves constitutional sheriffs are at risk of being killed, that's the 3,200 sheriffs. They're a little outnumbered, but
what isn't a question of who's going to win the war? It's a question of who gets hurt along the way.
Yes.
All right. Now here's another look at the Arpaio pardon, and of course, the basics that Trump would pardon Arpaio for a lot of the things that he wound up doing, which were racist and anti-immigrant, sends a signal to the anti-immigrant and white supremacist part of his base. Mm-hmm. You also know the idea that pardoning somebody who is a friend of Trump's sends the message that for our friends, and David Frum has a nice piece about this, for our friends we have protection, and for our enemies we have the law. And so that's what you see in authoritarian places. But Marcy Wheeler puts a finger on a third aspect of the Arpaio pardon, which one should not ignore. She has a piece called The Arpaio Pardon, You're Not the Audience.
Even though I saw it.
Even though you saw it. So while feeding his explicitly racist space with hateful rhetoric is important, it's even more important to ensure that cops remain with him, even as he fosters violence. There's no better way to do that than to convey to police that they can target brown people, that they can ignore all federal checks on their power with impunity. And this is probably one key reason why Trump has given up his efforts to oust Jeff Sessions, Department of Justice, because on policing they remain in perfect accord. There is no better way to keep the support of cops who support Trump because he encourages their abuses than by pardoning Arpaio for the most spectacular case of such abuses. You're not the audience for this pardon. The cops are. I would add, it's rumored today that he'll rescind the order preventing military equipment and stuff going to local police departments.
Yeah, largely because, of course, that was an Obama order, and
right,
secondly,
but also
because
fitting
they
in with
like
this
toys.
whole thing that we were just talking about here, because the police will support Trump, and that's all about, what he's attempting to do. He may be losing everybody else, but he's trying to keep his base, and he's trying to keep the police, and he'd prefer to keep on his side everyone who has guns.
I'm sure he would like that. We'll see whether that works. And whether he's able to make it
There are
happen.
checks and balances. I'm not saying that everything's falling apart, but, it does seem to be a pattern here.
Yeah. Well, it's a good observation. And, I'm interested to see whether he begins using his pardon power more frequently. The trend lately has been to wait until literally the very last days of a term to do any pardoning at all, even justified pardons, but to start so early and with such an egregious example, I'm curious where it goes next. And I guess the Bundys is a pretty good guess.
Right. So keep an eye on the Bundys.
He likes people
Josh
who cheat the
Chaffetz
government.
writing in the Washington Post, the problem with Joe Arpaio's pardon isn't the process. The problem is Joe Arpaio.
There we go. That's the one I had in mind.
Yep. One can easily imagine situations in which defiance of a court order is solely justified. We would want the pardon power to be available in those cases and can give some hypothetical. But this does not, however, suggest that the Arpaio pardon was acceptable. Instead, it points to the limits of thinking about the issue formally. Formal reasoning is seductive because it holds out the false promise of neutrality. We don't have to talk about messy issues like racism, xenophobia, state brutality. Instead, we can just dwell on whether normal procedures were followed and whether the president was insufficiently deferential to a judge. We can call these considerations the rule of law because that's something everybody can get behind. But as the hypothetical pardon makes clear, we don't think normal procedures should always be followed. We don't think judges should always be obeyed, especially for something like the pardon power, which by its very nature exists at the edges of the law. Trying to find formal, neutral, limiting factors that really ought to apply across the board will prove difficult, if not impossible. So how should we talk about the Arpaio pardon? Substantively. More specifically, we should talk about why, of all people with criminal records in the country, Trump chose to make Arpaio his first pardon.
Yes.
And then goes through a whole litany of all the stuff that he's done.
And they are terrible, and I probably shouldn't leave out of any complete list that Joe Arpaio has been around what I'll call an odd number of child molestation cases. Not only people who are Arpaio supporters who have joined his various posses, as he calls them, who have later been convicted of child or sex crimes targeting children, but that he has compiled a very strange record of failing to investigate or push arrests in cases where children have been sexually abused, and I find that odd. And disturbing and worthy of mention among the racist crimes that he's posted.
Well, it's also cost, I think, Arizona something like $140 million to defend suits against him.
Yes, including one time a fake assassination attempt that he staged against himself and then tried to frame somebody for that attempt. And that ended up costing millions. Wow.
Very odd. And then, in terms of a thought piece, I'll end with Martin Reddish, who's got a nice piece in the New York Times. A pardon for Arpaio would put Trump in uncharted territory.
Okay.
And basically goes through, anybody who's read the Federalist Papers knows how obsessed the framers were with the need to prevent tyranny. They were all too aware of the sad fate of all the republics that had preceded ours, rapid degeneration into tyranny. One of the most effective means of preventing that was the vesting of power of judicial review in a court system insulated from direct political pressures. Subsequent enactment of the Bill of Rights, which includes the Fifth Amendment and its due process clause, only strengthened the nation's resolve to prevent tyranny. It's long been recognized that the greatest threat of tyranny derives from the executive branch, where the commander-in-chief sits, overseeing not just the military, but a vast and growing network of law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Indeed, the Articles of Confederation didn't even provide for an executive for fear of what dangerous power he might exercise. While the Constitution, in contrast, recognizes a very practical need for an executive, and we just talked about how 19th century and 21st century presidents are different, that doesn't mean its framers feared the growth of tyranny any less. The Fifth Amendment's guarantee of neutral judicial process before deprivation of liberty cannot function with a weaponized pardon power that enables Trump or any president to circumvent judicial protections of constitutional rights. And so it's a problem. It's an issue. And just because he dumped it on a Friday night in the middle of a storm of epic biblical proportions doesn't mean it's any less important. And that's why we're spending so much time talking about it.
Yeah. There was a lot of speculation about the timing, but there was no good time for this one. But, yeah, very interesting that we should have been focused on prepping for and responding to this disaster. And he just gave us another one on top of it.
Right, and then his supporters started to complain that, why are you doing all this political stuff when we should be talking about Harvey?
Yeah,
Well, that's because the president made it political by doing this and also insisting he was going to go ahead with his transgender clean sweep of the military, which I don't want to ignore either.
Right. Oh, yes, we haven't gotten to that. Nor have we gotten to Jared and Ivanka being privately against the hurricane.
Oh, I'm sure they were.
Yes.
Anyway, so that's the summary. It's there's a lot going on over the weekend, but I just tried to bring everybody up to speed in terms of what people are talking about and give you some good articles to go by there. And with that, thanks for putting up with the echo there. I think David took the bucket off his head. The sound sounds a little bit better.
Oh, good. Okay.
Take care. And this was great work. I'm speaking with my friend David Waldman, Kagro, in the morning. And he'll be back tomorrow. I'll be back Wednesday.
All right. Very good. Thanks, Greg.
You're done traveling, right?
Aren't we always traveling in some sense? I don't know.
I think
I'm done. Yes, that's the plan. Remain in place. I'm sheltering in place.
Shelter in place and do the show from Kagro World Headquarters, where it's high and dry, and at least we have that. Take care, and I'll talk to you on Wednesday.
Okay, thanks very much, Greg. Yeah, if we ever have any heavy rains, we might be in trouble since we're apparently, broadcasting from the bottom of a well or a basement or something like that. What do we think about the quality of this call? Well, okay. It was pretty good, I thought. Now, hopefully the sound cleared up a little bit. We're just going to continue pressing buttons until we get things right. And then when we start seeing tweets from people saying the sound quality is perfect, fantastic, we will freeze the button settings in place at that point. This new broadcasting system gives us a lot more flexibility in terms of effects that you can put on the sounds. But, one, that means a lot more memory gets used and things crash easier. But two, more to the point, there's so many buttons to press, you don't know when to stop. Well, that one didn't fix it. What if I do this? And I'm not doing it particularly scientifically. I need some control mechanism, some effects that stay the same. And instead I just press all the buttons that I can. And at some point, we'll just end up sounding like aliens from Mars Attacks or something like that. And that may be very entertaining, and we could do the rest of the show on that. In fact, we could do the rest of the show on how do we sound, except then you wouldn't learn anything from all of this. So what else have we to catch up on, or other materials that we can bring to bear on the subjects taken up so far? Let's see. There's definitely a lot. We can get back to the Trump Tower story, and a lot of different takes on that one, not all of which are particularly hot. But the Washington Post, I think, was the leader on weekend news. I may have had it, I'm not sure. I didn't check dates and timestamps, etc. But according to the Twitter chatter, and it would stand to reason because the Washington Post, being a national newspaper, does have people on this beat. It seemed like their story was the one breaking out first. Trump's business sought deal on a Trump Tower in Moscow while he ran for president. How involved do you think Donald Trump was personally in seeking the deal? Well, the best evidence that he was intimately involved in the negotiations is that it failed and the tower has not come to fruition. That probably means he guided this thing personally, because he's actually terrible at negotiations and not a good deal maker. Anyway, Carol Leonig, Tom Hamburger, and Rosalind Helderman get the bylines on this August 27th piece. While Donald Trump was running for president in late 2015, that would be post-Golden Escalator, and early 2016, his company was pursuing a plan to develop a massive Trump Tower in Moscow, according to several people familiar with the proposal and new records reviewed by the Trump Organization lawyers. As part of the discussions, a Russian-born real estate developer urged Trump to come to Moscow to tout the proposal and suggested that he could get President Vladimir Putin to, quote, to say, quote, great things about Trump. Now, that quote might have come from Trump himself, great things. But a lot of his top cronies have taken on his affects there, and they begin to speak the way he does. Even as he suffers his cognitive deterioration, they echo it. Anyway, so he thought he could get Vladimir Putin to say great things about Trump, according to several people who have been briefed on his correspondence. That's Felix Sater, who we're talking about here. He predicted in a November 2015 email that he and Trump Organization leaders would soon be celebrating both one of the biggest residential projects in real estate history and Donald Trump's election as president, according to two of the people with knowledge of the exchange. Now, that might have been wishful thinking for anybody else in November of 2015, but it does lead to some speculation and some questions, given all of our suspicions of Russian interference in the election. Probably to this point, few of us have believed that anyone in Russia dared hope that their operation would work. But I suppose if they have the sort of confidence in themselves that Donald Trump evidences in himself, they might in fact have believed in November 2015 that they had a lock on this. And Felix Sater is just such a kind of person. So whether it's just Trump world bravado, plain old idiocy, delusional thinking, I don't know which, but he probably really did believe that he had it all worked out. Now, what's amazing, of course, would be the idea that you could successfully engineer a United States presidential election from Russia, but you couldn't engineer successfully a Trump Tower condominium hotel deal in Moscow from Moscow. So it is a little bit difficult to believe that they really thought that they had it all worked out, and much more likely that they were just talking. That's the locker room talk that they have. I don't know what else they might talk about it, but in the Trump world locker rooms, they talk about landing the biggest deal ever and making the greatest deals in the world and becoming president, I guess. Sater wrote to Trump Organization Executive Vice President Michael Cohen, another scumbag of some renown, something to the effect of, can you believe two guys from Brooklyn are going to elect a president? Remember, Sater is Russian-born, but has spent much of his life, yes, living in Brooklyn. Michael Cohen, Brooklyn-born, I think, and spent most of his life living there, but a little too intimately connected with weirdos in Russia to be called entirely American in spirit, I'd say. But that's only because of the sorts of deals that he's put together and the people he works for. Anyway, I guess at some point he wrote him something to the effect of, that's in quotes, I guess talking to Sater, he said, I sent something to the effect of, quote, again, can you believe two guys from Brooklyn are going to elect a president? That, according to one person briefed on the email exchange, Sater emigrated from what was then the Soviet Union when he was 6 and grew up in Brooklyn. And he knew Michael Cohen along the way. We did read that story a few weeks ago that they actually were familiar with one another. They weren't intimate in the earlier years, but they had crossed paths as young kids in the past. Trump never went to Moscow as Sater proposed. He had already been to Moscow, of course, in 2013 for the infamous Miss Universe pageant there. We've heard a lot about that. But he never made this follow-up visit that Sater had proposed. And although investors and Trump's company signed a letter of intent, they lacked the land and permits to proceed, and the project was abandoned at the end of January of 2016, just before the presidential primaries began, several people familiar with the proposal said. Nevertheless, the details of the deal, which have not previously been disclosed, provide evidence that Trump's business was actively pursuing significant commercial interests in Russia at the same time he was campaigning to be president of the United States, by the way, in case you were confused about that, and in a position to determine U.S.-Russia relations, which are relatively speaking, I think, important both here, there, and elsewhere around the world. I think a lot of people had a lot of interest in how that was going to go. The new details from the emails, which are scheduled to be turned over to congressional investigators soon, also point to the likelihood of additional contacts between Russia-connected individuals and Trump associates during his presidential bid. White House officials declined to comment for this report. Cohen, a longtime Trump legal advisor, declined to comment, but his attorney, Stephen Ryan, that's Cohen, the attorney's attorney, Stephen Ryan, said his client has been cooperating and will continue to cooperate with both the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, including providing them with documents and information and answering any questions they may have about the Moscow building proposal. In recent months, contacts between high-ranking and low-level Trump aides and Russians have emerged. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, he would be a high-ranking Trump aide, then a U.S. senator and campaign advisor, twice met Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, that we know of. Donald Trump Jr., of course, organized the June 2016 meeting. That's probably even giving himself too much credit for it, but organized the June 2016 meeting with campaign aide Jared Kushner, and you might as well remind everybody, yes, that's his son-in-law. Donald Trump Sr.'s son-in-law, of course. Campaign manager Paul Manafort and a Russian lawyer, Veselnitskaya, we keep hearing her name, after the president's eldest son, Don Trump Jr., was promised that the lawyer, Veselnitskaya, would bring damaging information about Hillary Clinton as part of a Russian government effort to help the campaign, which didn't surprise him in the least, somehow. Internal emails also show campaign advisor George Papadopoulos, I should make it's an O sound there, Papadopoulos, repeatedly sought to organize meetings with campaign officials, including Trump himself and Putin himself or other Russians. His efforts were rebuffed, but they were there nonetheless. The negotiations for the Moscow project ended before Trump's business ties to Russia had become a major issue in the campaign. Trump denied having any business connections to Russia in July of 2016, tweeting, "For the record, I have zero," and he capitalizes all those letters, "investments in Russia." And then insisting at a news conference the following day, "I have nothing to do with Russia." And I don't know when did they say it? So early, around January, they had abandoned things. Is that right? Is that the claim? Where do we see January mentioned? Why does that ring a bell for me? Okay, well, and it's certainly not that much, certainly not a whole lot of time passes between having a letter of intent, yes, I intend to try to do this, and giving it up, and then claiming I got nothing to do with Russia. I tried and failed to have something to do with Russia. That's not the same thing, but you're never going to get the truth like that out of Trump. Discussions about the Moscow project began in earnest in September of 2015. So what are we talking about there? September 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, a little, it's almost a year, but it's less than a year. 10 months, I guess, between beginning the negotiations in earnest and then swearing that you have nothing whatsoever to do with Russia. That's not a lot of time for a deal like that. I mean, 10 months, it goes by quickly for most of us, but in terms of trying to get a major development in another country done, I don't think that's a very long time. So where were we? Discussions about the Moscow project began in earnest in September of 2015, according to people briefed on the deal. An unidentified investor, why can't we identify these guys, planned to build the project and, under a licensing agreement, put Trump's name on it. Okay, so standard deal in Trump's latter days. Cohen acted as lead negotiator for the Trump Organization. It's unclear how involved or aware Trump was of the negotiations, which is an amazing thing all by itself. The possibility that Donald Trump has no idea what's going on in the Trump Organization. On the one hand, you want to think that's not possible. He's he's inseparable from the functioning of the Trump organization. That's his whole world. On the other hand, he seems like such an idiot sometimes. You think it could possibly be true. But his reputation has always been for a pretty intimate involvement in all of his projects, not always to the benefit of those projects. In fact, very often to their detriment. And he's a meddler and a tinkerer, and also a terrible influence on himself and everyone around him. So anyway, the idea that he has no idea, or that lack of any involvement might somehow excuse his having claimed a few months later to have nothing whatsoever to do with Russia, I don't think that's really going to fly. I wouldn't let it. Anyway, where were we here? Not sure, unclear how involved or aware Trump was of the negotiations. As the talks progressed, Trump voiced numerous supportive comments about Putin, setting himself apart from his Republican rivals for the nomination. By the end of 2015, Putin began offering praise in return, and we know how important that is to Donald Trump, and so it makes us suspicious that we're on to something here. We'll discuss it after our next break, taking place here. We are back with more Kagro in the Morning show right here on Netroots Radio. That was super professional. I like the way I cut out of that last break. Here comes the next break right now. We're taking place right now. I did a great job with that one. I could have said coming up next or right after this. But, I'm working on professionalizing these things. Why? I don't know. There's no particular, there's no reward for it as far as I can tell. But we like to make things sound good for our friends in Rochester Free Radio. And, it's nice. Well, it's free radio. So, what's the big concern? How much money gets lost in free radio? Not much. Okay. But for them, it's a commercial concern. And so we wanted to accommodate them. And I think that probably in the future, as we expand, if we are able to expand to more terrestrial radio stations, they will all appreciate those breaks. And it doesn't really matter whether I'm professionally able to introduce the fact that they're coming up, just so long as they take place and you can hear on your local station, what station am I listening to? And it gives us an opportunity, of course, which we should capitalize on a little bit more, to say, yes, you're back listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show. I'm David Waldman, your host, KagroX on Twitter. Don't ask where the name came from. Just accept it. I will tell you the story as we add new radio stations. That's the incentive. If you need the origin story, why do you call yourself KagroX? The short answer is, I don't know. It was one of those dumb things that people did on the internet at some point. But if you'd like more detail than that, well, talk to your local radio station about adding our program to their lineup. And then as a reward, we can tell you and the new audience that we garner exactly how that name came about. I promise you it will, but it's kind of a disappointing story. Don't pin your hopes to getting any real insight into life. It's just one of those little picayune stories. Sometimes it's fun to learn those things and get some sense of a person's background. But the big news, of course, would be that we were on in a new market, and that would be a great thing. So hi, Rochester. How's it going? How are you enjoying things so far? Are things better now that you know what you're listening to? And we give our friends at the radio station an opportunity to identify themselves and give you some public service announcements along the way? Or would you rather we tell you how many minutes of breaks do we take? 5 minutes more of our fabulous stories, and they just simply quickly sneak in there that you're listening to our radio station in Rochester in between breaths. I think it's probably better and professional sounding. Okay. When we left off before the break, because we were such professionals, we were talking about, the existence of an ongoing negotiation to build a Trump Tower Moscow during the presidential election, and 2, how it began to affect things, that were happening in the race, or things we saw in the news about the weirdness. This would be about the first time that we really began to notice in the main how strange the relationship between Russia and many Russians and Donald Trump really was. It was startling to see a Republican grow that close for no particular reason, and not even substantively close, just superficially and grossly close to Vladimir Putin. No one was able to figure out exactly what was going on there. And at the time, we were offered the explanation that Donald Trump likes nice things said about Donald Trump, and that's how he explained things. Hey, Putin said nice things about me. What am I going to do? Say bad things about him? Sure, why not? What do you care? You're running for president of the United States. Nobody's going to be upset if you criticize Putin. Putin will be, but who cares about that here? Putin doesn't vote. Then we found out he does. So I guess that makes some more sense. So what else happened at the time? He says that he wants to move to another closer level of relations. Closer level of relations. That's not hard to say. I don't know why I'm having such trouble with it. Can we not welcome that? Of course we welcome that. Putin told it was in Russian. That's why I couldn't read it. Putin told reporters during his annual end-of-the-year news conference, he called Trump a colorful and talented person. He is colorful. He's orange. Trump said afterward that the compliment was an honor. Meh. Though Putin's comments came shortly after Sater suggested that the Russian president would speak favorably about Trump, there is no indication that the two are connected. There is no public record that Trump ever spoke about the effort to build the Trump Tower in 2015 and 16. Trump's interests in building in Moscow, however, are long-standing. He had attempted to build a Trump property there for 3 decades. And there's another story about that I think in the New York Times. We can probably skip over the story, save it for another day, and move on to another topic shortly. But let's wrap up with this one here. No public record that he had ever spoken about it. Trump's interests long-standing, starting with a failed effort in 1987 to partner with the Soviet government on a hotel project, because that would have been normal. Russia is one of the hottest places in the world for investment, he said in a 2007 court deposition. He's not a believer in climate change or global warming. He did believe Russia was one of the hottest places to, make videos of God knows what in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, probably. And a great place for mail-order brides. That's true, too, in Trump world. But we meant investment. We will be in Moscow at some point, he promised in the deposition. I guess that's where those comments came from, a 2007 court deposition. So far, not true. So I guess that's perjury. It really doesn't qualify, but good promise there, Pally. Sater was involved in at least one of these previous efforts. In 2005, the Trump Organization gave his development company, the Bayrock Group, we hear about them all over the place, an exclusive 1-year deal to attempt to build a Moscow Trump Tower. Sater located a site for the project, an abandoned pencil factory, and it is terribly sad when people abandon their pencils. I must admit, I have a soft spot for this project now, and worked closely with Trump on the deal, which did not come to fruition. Though the pencils didn't come out very well either. An abandoned pencil factory. These pencils are pre-abandoned. We build them that way. In an unrelated court case in 2008, Sater said in a deposition that he would personally provide Trump verbal updates on the deal. Gee whiz. Thanks a lot about that one. In an unrelated, when I come back, pop my head into Mr. Trump's office and tell him, moving forward on the Moscow deal. And he would say, all right, Sater said. Sater got paid for nothing. That guy had the best job in the world. How are we doing on that? He didn't even ask. Trump didn't ask that. He would stick his head in and say, we're doing great on Moscow. Okay. Good to know. 3 scoops of ice cream, please. In the same testimony, Sater described traveling with Trump's children, including joining Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr. on a trip to Moscow at their father's request. They were on their way by themselves, and he was all concerned, Sater said. He asked if I wouldn't mind joining them and looking after them while they were in Moscow. Alan Garten, a lawyer for the Trump Organization, by most accounts, he's usually named as the top lawyer, even over and above Michael Cohen. He told the Washington Post last year that Sater happened to be in Moscow at the same time as Trump's 2 adult children. There was no accompanying them to Moscow. Now, I'm not sure why that would make a tremendous amount of difference, but it is obviously directly contradictory. Sater says, Donald Trump asked me to take his kids to Moscow. Donald Trump's lawyer says, Donald Trump never did any such thing. It was a total coincidence that they were in Moscow at the same time. That's really weird. Neither Sater nor his attorney has responded to requests for comment on that. Trump has repeatedly tried to distance himself from this guy who served time in jail after assaulting a man with the stem of a broken margarita glass. And I believe he also broke the margarita glass. So that's property damage. He's a bad guy. During a 1991 bar fight, he didn't just find the stem. And pleaded guilty in 1998 to his role, this is a second conviction, in an organized crime-linked stock fraud. That's more Trump's speed, I think. Sater's sentencing was delayed for years. Why? Because he was cooperating with the federal government on a series of criminal and national security-related investigations, federal officials have said. During that time, Sater worked as an executive with Bayrock, whose offices were in Trump Tower, and brokered deals to license Trump's name for developments in multiple U.S. and foreign cities. In 2010, Trump allowed Sater to briefly work out of Trump Organization office space and use a business card that identified him as a senior advisor to Donald Trump. Still, when asked about Sater in 2013 court depositions, Trump said, if he were sitting in the room right now, I really wouldn't know what he looked like. He added that he had spoken with Sater not many times. There's, of course, millions of pictures all over the internet of the two of them hanging out at the Trump Soho launch party. Still lots of questions in my mind about why you have a launch party for a condo building, but the answer is hot chicks, mail ordered from Russia. What else do you need to know? Trump vodka, buy it, drink it. So the guy's been living the grifter lifestyle since forever. Sater, one of his top grifters. And we're back on topic with him again. We're never going to be done with him. And I guess the fact that he's back in the news just means that Robert Mueller is having a closer look at what he's been up to. I mentioned to you that there's a New York Times article out there. We'll put that one aside for now, but just let you know, they picked up on that angle of the story mentioned in the post here. For Trump, 3 decades of chasing deals in Russia. And the piece is illustrated by a photo of Trump, frankly, looking drunk, although I understand he doesn't drink, at the 2013 Miss Universe pageant in Moscow, surrounded by pageant contestants and other women. Melania nowhere in the photo, as far as I can tell, but that's between the two of them. In the meantime, Armando has joined us to help us shift some gears. Good morning, Armando. We wanted to talk about the other big subject of the weekend that wasn't the flood or Donald Trump.
I don't know how big it was, but
well, on our corner of Twitter,
can I give you a couple thoughts on this Sater thing before we switch?
Oh yeah, sure.
It's part of what we have said. Again, you could hear tomorrow's news 2 years in advance.
All right.
That Trump is a grifter who doesn't really have a real estate empire. The concept of this deal was somebody else was building the tower.
Yeah.
And they were going to pay Trump to slap the name on it.
Right. And, at that point he was a reality TV, which wasn't very realistic, but what they describe as reality TV, star. And in Russia, American things, and particularly glitzy American things that are on American television, are huge. And Trump did have a name. I mean, it was falling apart at that point, but he had a huge reputation in Russia. You know, when people say, I'm huge in Japan, right? He was big in Russia.
David Hasselhoff is big in Germany.
Right, yeah. There's countries that suit people. And Russian oligarchs with money to burn loved the Trump brand for a number of reasons. Even if he wasn't helping them launder money, they probably just liked the idea of that was as American as it could get. It's like getting a hold of a Cadillac. It's gaudy.
Maybe. Or it could have just been a way to pay him.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly was. But, the added bonus, of course, was, I can, buy several of these condos and launder money that way. I don't know what they really got out of paying Trump. Trump didn't really offer them much more than an opportunity to launder money.
But the tower situation came up when he started running for president. maybe pay him to run for president so he could be a decisive force.
Yeah, maybe.
But,
all the other people profited enormously. Sater, for as much grifting as Trump was doing, Sater was that much worse. He barely knew how to, he doesn't know how to build a building. And Trump doesn't really either, but he could administer in his golden days, he was able to administer that sort of thing. I think he's lost that touch, but Sater never had it.
The only real estate he owns is these golf courses.
Yes, well, he loves his golf.
I thought it was interesting because David Frum finally noticed this.
Wow.
As I said, you get tomorrow's news 2 years in advance on Kagro in the morning.
There's a lot of people who are surprising me about what they've missed along the way.
Yes,
it
really is.
Howard Dean said something the other day that might help us transition to the DNC, but what did he say?
Tell me. Yeah, because Dean actually weighed in.
Yeah, so what was it? But I'm trying to remember exactly what it was that he finally discovered, and he was amazed. I don't know. I'll have to check his Twitter feed. Now I can't remember whether it was in relation. I think it was in relation to something that Trump did or was mixed up in, and yes, hello. That's been well known for a long time where you've been.
Yeah. It's amazing how much they don't know and how many people really buy into the, hey, he's a real, business genius, but he's not.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty crappy. He hit on a great formula in the licensing. Somebody else worry about building buildings, and then at the end, in exchange for X million dollars or some percentage of the profits, you can call it a Trump building. Sure, go ahead.
Again, I remember this in the odds, and I've told you this before, but I think it was actually Junior's idea.
Oh, yeah?
But whatever. Let's not give him credit.
Yeah. Okay, I believe it.
Anyway, let me tell you about the Dem Commission, and I'll tell you what's going on.
All right, and I'll see if I can find it.
I sussed it out 2.5 months ago. I think I'm echoing. Am I echoing?
I don't hear it, and I have no complaints that say so, but it wouldn't be surprising given what was happening with Greg.
Right. Well, let me plow forward and see what happens. 2.5 months ago, believe it or not, you remember that People Summit in Chicago that they had with, Bernie and all the Bernies. And there was excoriation of closed primaries at this event, led by Namaki Combs, who is a reporter, something for the Young Turks, and is sort of self-styled as the left flank. Anyway, she was designated to be on what was something called the DNC Unity and Reform Commission. So what is the Unity and Reform Commission? The Unity and Reform Commission is something they came up with just before the convention in 2016 to smooth the waters and make everything better, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
And the commission, I believe, has 10 people designated at the time by Hillary Clinton's group, 8 by Bernie Sanders' group. And, I'm hearing that I am echoing, David. You know what I'm going to do?
Yeah, people say it, but...
Let me try calling back. I'd like to get this back and see if it works.
We'll see if it's any better than before. I guess it's something with Skype, and I'm checking all my configurations. It says that you're like inside an abandoned pencil factory, which I think really should just be used as a metaphor for everything. Isn't life a little bit like being inside an abandoned pencil factory on the outskirts of Moscow? I think so. All right, let's see. Here we go. We'll connect you again, Armando. I can't promise nothing, but let's try it again.
Okay. Yeah, it's still echoing, but let's plow through, I guess.
All right,
I'm pretty sure I'm going to echo. But let me plow through it. The commission was created, the Unity and Reform Commission was created to smooth over the waters and reform the process going forward. Remember, there was complaints mostly about superdelegates at the time.
Yes.
But they also wanted open primaries, Bernie wasn't bothered by caucuses, but a lot of us have always been bothered by caucuses. And it turns out, if you look at the mandate that was given the commission at the time, it was stated to do a few things. One of them was to encourage wider use of primary elections in lieu of caucuses. And in states where that wasn't happening, to make caucuses as much like primaries as possible. Remember, one of the biggest problems with primaries is there's a limited time. It takes a lot of time, and it's not a secret ballot. All these things that normally you think of as bad if you're a Democrat. But people say, hey, this is party building or whatever. I never bought into that. But even if I bought into it, it's not worth the sacrifice of voter participation. The record is clear. The participation in caucuses is a fraction of what even a closed primary is, by a factor of 4. And we have real-life examples. In 2016, there was a caucus in Washington. It drew 223,000 people. Later, there was a beauty contest primary, a mail-in.
Right.
And it drew over nearly 800,000 votes. So it was almost 4 times as much. Similarly, in Nebraska, there was a caucus. It had 23,000 participants. Then there was a beauty contest primary paid by the state that drew 100,000 votes. It's not even an argument. Everybody knows caucuses suppress voters. That's a fact. It's not arguable. Now, if you want to argue that it's worth it to suppress voters in order to do whatever else you want to do, that's your prerogative. I always think of a North Star for all Democrats, especially in this time of voter suppression tactics by the Republicans, that getting as many people to vote as possible should always be the goal, no matter who it helps. Okay, so fast forward. The mandate says try to encourage primaries, try to discourage caucuses. If there are caucuses, make them as much like primaries as possible. And there is, to the degree that you can encourage open primaries, it's also there for whatever reason. It's not my favorite, but I'm prepared to accept that as a part of the idea. Well, more voter participation. Here's the problem: primaries themselves, open, closed, are run by states. State governments decide whether they're open or whether they're closed. Some of these states are run by Republicans. We ran across this problem in Florida in 2008 when the DNC was very firm on its primary schedule. And it decided that Florida Republicans moved it up ahead of schedule. The DNC said no delegates for you. The same for Michigan. No delegates for you either. And it's a very difficult thing for the DNC to control the primary process, both in terms of scheduling, but also in terms of what type of primary they're going to hold. There are many states, big states, that have closed primaries. Florida, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania are 4 that come to mind for me, New Jersey as well. And there's, you're either going to tell them how to do it or you're not. Fast forward to a few months ago, I told you about the People's Convention and excoriating closed primaries. I was suspicious because they don't attack caucuses. And I said to myself, what can they do here? What's the game plan? Well, maybe let's give them a benign story. They want to force states to have open primaries. So what they were planning on doing would, I think, and I still think it's the case, and I think that their defense of caucuses this weekend will bear this out. But let's go back to 2 months ago. I suspected that they were going to propose a rule that if a state holds a closed primary, a state party cannot choose its delegates through a closed primary. It must hold the caucus.
Okay. All right.
That's unacceptable. It's what Washington State does by choice. It's a terrible choice they make. And 2 states have abolished caucuses that had them, Minnesota and Maine. Washington should not do what it's doing. The state of Washington pays for a primary. We should use those results. The same for Nebraska. And the same for any state where there's a primary. Those are 2 that I know of. If a state doesn't pay for a primary, what are you going to do? You have to hold the caucus, but make that caucus as much like a primary as possible. To the degree you can accept mail-in ballots, do it. To the degree that you can have just a drop-off situation where people just come and drop off their ballots, so much the better. If you can make extended hours or have even early voting, days of voting, do it. Don't make this a 2-hour Iowa thing. The Iowa caucus is an abomination to democracy. It is not a model to be followed. It is a model to be reviled and punished. We should reduce their delegates for anybody who does it that way. Let's incentivize that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a soft spot for the idea of caucuses. The huge problem, again, is that there aren't that many people who can dedicate 2, 3, 4, 5 hours to sitting there doing the things that you need to do to have an actual caucus. I love the idea of people really engaging. That's great, but about 0% of the American population can really do that.
Well, David,
that's a huge problem.
Republicans
You can't get around
say,
that.
why are we having early voting? What's wrong with voter ID?
Right.
Let's shorten the hours of the day.
It essentially ends up being the same thing. Yeah.
What if the Republican proposal for general elections was let's hold caucuses? How would you feel about that?
That would make it easier to be critical from the outset because the Republicans do it.
It's the same idea, David. We want more voters. But what is it? Why do you want open primaries? To get more voters, presumably.
Yes. That's what I assume is that's the best sounding motivation.
If you are for open primaries, you must, by logic, be completely against caucuses.
It would stand to reason. But we know that doesn't control.
All right. The closed primary, open primary, I have a view that I prefer closed primaries, but I don't think it matters as much as people say. I don't think the rat effing threat is that big.
Okay.
But I just think it's better than Democrats. Listen, it's not that hard. Have same-day registration. You really want to vote in the Democratic primary? At least check the box. Call yourself a Democrat.
Sure.
Go through that exercise at least. All right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty fair. Certainly there are people who say, well, I think they have arguments about why you should be more open to it. And well, what if people want to identify as these days Democratic Socialists and they don't want to join the Democratic Party? Well, if it doesn't cost any money and you're not donating anything, and all you have to do is check the box and say, I intend, at the very least, if the person I vote for wins the primary, then I'll vote for them, even though they're a Democrat and I'm not. If that's all the box means, I don't see why you don't check it. If you can't live up to that,
or if
go somewhere else.
Checking the box is such an affront to your principles, then maybe you should be voting in a Democratic primary.
Maybe that's something to consider too. We're about a minute away from our break here, by the way. I'll give you a little cue, but we got about 40 seconds to talk our way into it.
All right. Well, when we come back, I want to talk about the events of the weekend, which got pretty heated. And I think that I'm going to try to be more generous than I was on Twitter to these people, so I can.
Well, that would be nice.
Try to see
these people, they're in trouble already.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, language. Okay. All right. So we'll come back in just a few. Well, we're going to take a 2-minute break in a few seconds. We'll be back with more Kagro in the Morning here on Netroots Radio. Stick around for that. We'll be back with Armando and discussing how to proceed in Democratic primaries next time around. Stay tuned. We're back with the very exciting musical portion of the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Armando has held on during the break, and I did an amazing thing and totally re-engineered everything, and I think the echo is gone. All that we did was, of course, have Armando call back on his phone using the Skype setting there, and hopefully the echo will be gone. We'll give it a shot, but before we get back to where we were on the primaries question, I did have this. I finally fished out the Howard Dean tweet from the weekend that had me so surprised. It just reads this way. This is a shocker. Jill Stein was, he says, likely a part of the Russian effort to elect Trump. Had Stein not been on the ballot, we might not have Trump. And he is retweeting his own tweet, surprised at having found at this point, and I'm surprised that it took him so long, the infamous photo of the RT gala dinner in Moscow in 2015 at which Vladimir Putin, Jill Stein, and Mike Flynn are all at the table. And about a dozen people immediately told him, what? We've been pointing at this photo for a year. You just now have figured out that she was there. Although, I got to be honest, I'm still not convinced. I still do not understand what this photo means other than, it means something for me. Flynn, like, okay, obviously you're a spy. It's a bad thing. Jill Stein, I still have trouble even putting my finger on what did she think she was doing there, and what would she think she was doing during the campaign even. I still don't see her as just being involved in any kind of a plot. Greens run presidential candidates. She was that person. That Green candidate criticizes the campaigns of both mainstream major party candidacies all the time. That's their thing. That's what they do. But what was she doing there? That is weird.
I think that the way to think of her is not as a, some mastermind, but just, a useful idiot.
I mean, I guess so, in the sense that any Green Party candidate would have been considered by somebody who wants to mess with U.S. politics, and that means, by definition, messing with the two major parties, a useful idiot. Even if they're a genius, Vladimir Putin would be trying to use them. And it's not clear that a genius would see anything particularly wrong with doing that and allowing him to do that. I got a dinner out of it. I don't know. I don't suspect she'll sign
if she
or
had
anything.
known that she was being used.
I guess. Yes, I would think so. Anyway, but I just found it interesting that, to be honest, speaking of useful idiots, Howard Dean, you missed this? Where you been? You ran for president once. I thought you were a political junkie. I guess he's busy, but I mean, I'm supposed to be busy too.
Howard's okay. I mean,
I don't hate him.
Fun trivia fact, Howard's blocked me on Twitter.
Well, he would have seen the picture if he hadn't done that. That's stupid. See, now you look like an idiot.
Too.
You're isolating yourself. You live in a bubble.
I definitely tweeted out that picture.
All right. I'm just surprised by this, although I shouldn't be. Every once in a while, something like that happens, or you have a discussion with a senator and you say something about it. If you happen to be at their town hall or whatever, you mention something. Oh, I hadn't heard that. And the whole crowd is like, what? And I'm not talking about like, what was his name? Ben Nelson saying, I don't know how to use an ATM. Although that would have made me do the same. I would have had the same reaction. But just stuff like, did you know that, whatever, George W. Bush choked on a pretzel? What? Really? When? Like 12 years ago.
Right.
Oh, I had no idea. Okay. Wasn't important, but I mean, it was sort of like a cultural touchstone for political junkies.
It shows sometimes, disconnects.
Bless you.
Wow, you heard that.
It wasn't a pretzel, was it?
Yeah, Dr. Howard Dean. I need a house call.
I can do the Heimlich over Skype. Okay.
That's right.
So where were we? We were on the DNC question.
I was bringing you up to date to the weekend.
Yes.
All right. So I told you about the attacks on closed primaries, and they started the weekend attacking closed primaries again. Mm-hmm. And again, if you're for open primaries, you can say, well, closed primaries are terrible because open primaries. But then the weekend progressed, and it was closed primaries are terrible, but look at these wonderful caucuses. And that's when and a lot of us just went, what are you talking about?
Now, are caucuses, I mean, aside from the fact that they're exclusive because you have to show up for so long, are they generally open in the sense that primaries, the ones that they want to have open primaries, can you just walk in and say, today I'm a Democrat?
But you know what they mean by closed is you have to say you're a Democrat and you write your name down.
Yeah. But do you not have to do that for a caucus? I would think that would be even a bigger issue at a caucus.
I don't think they have voter rolls or anything. I think you show up. I mean, there is, frankly, a real issue of security at caucuses. I don't mean to belittle people who hold them. They do the best they can, but when you don't have a list of the voter rolls, what are you doing? And how do they tell you who they are? We're not going to, we're Democrats. We don't ask for ID.
Yeah.
What do they show us? Registration cards? There's a million problems, and I think that you're putting your hand on one, your finger on one of them. But I just think the 2 hours and being there for 2 hours.
That's very tough.
The doors open and they close, and if you're not in between 7 and 8, you can't vote. What is that?
That doesn't sound very open.
It sounds very closed, and that's why there's less participation. Even in Iowa, the masterpiece, the role model that they all want us to look at. 200,000 Iowans vote in the caucuses out of what? 1.4 million people or something like that. Hey, that sounds impressive. Oh, actually, that's not right. It's 3.1 million. Someone did this calculation. Iowa, 3.1 million people, 200,000 participants. No, New Hampshire, 1.3 million people, 300,000 voters. It's just, and those are the two, hey, we love New Hampshire. I hate them both. But I don't hate them. I hate that they go first. And you see the direct comparison. It is voter suppression. It simply is. There's no other way of looking at it.
Not if you're going to make an issue about it.
So they're telling us how great caucuses are. And James Zogby, who's also on the commission, went on and on about how they are a political tradition, caucuses. I mean, that's the defense now. So are Confederate monuments. And to put more of a point on it, so are closed primaries.
That's true too. I don't see the logic of defending the caucus there. It's a lovely idea, but
here's the instrumentalist view that I can come up with.
All right,
David. We are going to threaten closed primary states, and if they don't open it up, we're not going to accept their delegates. And the only way you can justify that is if you say closed primaries are so bad that we have to push this nuclear button.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to make it not be a nuclear button if they have to do caucuses.
Yeah.
Because then if caucuses are worse, which they are, then how can you threaten, oh, really? I hate the way you're suppressing voters. If you don't stop it, I'm going to make you suppress even more.
Yeah, that doesn't make a great deal of sense.
No, it doesn't. Now, people have a second, a less benign, and frankly, I'm more prone to this one on Twitter, and I think it's true. But as I said, open mind, maybe they're just trying to use a pressure point to get open primaries. The reality is Zogby, Kantz, Turner, West, the 8 designees that Bernie picked for this are very well aware that Bernie did better, much better, enormously much better in caucuses than primaries.
Yes.
If you increase the number of caucuses, particularly in big states where he got demolished, and these are 4 of them. Florida, he lost by 32 points. New York, he lost by 17 points. New Jersey, he lost by 25 points. Pennsylvania, he lost by 14 points. Make those caucuses, and he breaks even or comes closer. That's certainly going to help his chances of being the nominee in 2020.
Presumably. Yes.
That's the malignant view of what they're doing.
Okay.
And those are enormous amounts of delegates. Bernie lost by 85 delegates in Florida. He lost by 75 in New York. He lost by 40 in Pennsylvania. He lost by 42, 45 in New Jersey. That's 2/3 of his deficit to Hillary.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can look at this cynically and think that's what they've got going. And unfortunately, that's what they're carrying. And the reason why is the arguments for caucuses are absurd. There is no good argument for a caucus. Well, unless you want to make one now, Dave.
I'm trying to think. I guess I'm stuck on. Well, it's not a good argument to say there's such a lovely idea. It's great when people talk and take it seriously and put lots of time into considering their vote, but I don't know anyone who really wants to do that all the time. And I know lots of people who say, I can't do that. If that's what it takes to cast a ballot in this state, I can't participate. And how do you justify that?
You have to listen to speeches and listen to people harangue you, and then you have to go stand in a corner.
Yes, it's not.
And then they count the number of people in the corner, and if there's not enough people, then other people get to decide they're going to switch from one corner to the other corner.
Yes. It's all fascinating for people who can handle things that way. And for anybody else who has to be at work or has kids or just doesn't like standing in corners for hours at a time or just says, I've made up my mind. I know what I want to do. Even I'm sure that 60% of caucus goers, I'm guessing, I'm going to pull a number out of a hat, get there and say, I know who I'm voting for, and there's no corner you can put me in that's going to make me change my mind. And typically speaking, there will be people who are like, I feel that way about such and such a fringe or minority candidate that's never going to be viable, and I might leave if they're not viable. I won't stick around. Okay, fine. But in the main, people come and they say, guess what? I'm for the front runner. And I know that. And am I closed-minded and I won't allow anybody to persuade me otherwise? Or is it, maybe I've done all the homework that I can possibly stand, and I know the arguments backwards and forwards on all these people, and I know who's for who and why, and I'm going to do this. And why can't I just show up and say, look, you disagree, but I happen to be for Smith, and that's that, and it's not going to change. And if I could just write that down on a piece of paper, I could go back to work or pick my kids up from school. But then you won't be here unless he's not viable. Well, he's the leading candidate. He's going to be viable. It's going to be fine. And you know what? If it's not viable, throw my vote away. I don't care. I'm so sure that's who I want. Why won't you just give it to me? Why do I have to stand here and not pick my kids up from school and not earn at work today and maybe get fired to convince you that 2 hours later I'm still for the leading candidate? What's wrong with you? So, it's a big issue.
I think that there's an easy way to handle this.
Vote.
You have that 2-hour caucus session or 4-hour caucus session for everybody who wants to go do that and stand in quarters. And the rest of us can just drop our ballots in a box.
Yes. And
why not?
Well, because, of course, then it's really not a caucus. And people who love caucuses will say, I can't talk to pieces of paper and convince them otherwise. But,
that's the point. I don't want to talk to you.
That may
talk
be.
To the people that do want to talk to you.
Right. Well, you could have, when you could have changed my mind? When you came knocking on my door. So why, you love door knocking and haranguing people? Come knock on my door and see if you can convince me before the caucus date. Well, but gee whiz, it's so early. Well, so what? I don't care. It's so early. So's the caucus. It's the middle of winter. We're out here caucusing. Knock on my door earlier. You all you came to Iowa for Howard Dean in orange hats. Maybe you wouldn't do it the same way next time. But, what's the difference of whether you convince me indoors at that school next week? Yeah. Next week, you're going to convince me? Convince me now. Well, we can't get to everybody. This brings everybody to one place and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I know. But, organize. You keep telling me, organize, work hard. So organize and work hard. Knock on my door. It's much easier if you come here. Well, it's much easier if I hold you captive in my basement, too. But I'm not going to do that because I have to let you go vote. But it sucks. It's stupid.
I can grant them all the wonders of a caucus, and I don't.
I love the idea.
But suppose it's all true. It's not worth knocking out, 70% of the electorate.
I think that's the bottom line of it. And there are hybrid systems that you can, if you want that kind of engagement for your political junkies, then do these primaries that feed into a graduated system of conventions, and let all the junkies go and try to convince one another, but then in order for it to mean anything, then you'd have to make the primary itself non-binding in a sense, and maybe that's even
no, you can't do that. I mean, that's the whole point. Listen, do you believe in democracy or not?
I mean,
the Electoral College is a caucus, I suppose, is the argument. Well, look, we could have, if they had come and meet, somebody could have talked them out of voting for Trump.
That's true, and none of them would do it, and they all insisted that it was unconstitutional for them to caucus at that point.
It's crazy.
It's just troublesome.
That's just the bottom line. Look, again, I think
it's a fantasy
the more
and a nice
benign one is they're trying to get open primaries and think this is a pressure point. The less benign one is caucuses are the best thing that ever happened to Bernie, and they want him to be able to have Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, to name 4, be caucus states instead of closed primary states. And that would be a huge advantage to it.
You almost wonder if, it might be worth it. You know what? Fine. New York is a caucus state. They come out and they caucus 80% for someone other than Bernie Sanders, and then they say, caucuses aren't so good.
Listen, we all do that. Don't get me wrong. But
fair enough.
But caucuses are so openly voter suppression. Listen, I didn't know who the candidate was. I've hated them for 20 years. As long as I've known about them.
Caucusing. And by the same token, I think it's charming, but when you think about who can go and who can't, I don't buy it. And it's funny too. This has nothing to do with the other necessarily, but with a lot of people very doggedly reminding people, for instance, as we watch the hurricane in Houston, why don't people pay more attention to those evacuation orders? It's so clear that that's a dangerous place to be. Why don't you go? And so many smart people very correctly pointing out, it's not like everybody can just pack up and go, and it costs money, and people are supposed to show up for work even though there's a disaster going on, and it's highly insensitive for you, and it is, to say, why don't you just evacuate? Well, why don't you just not go to work that day and go caucus for 3 hours? Well, kind of in many cases the same reason. And it's weird that very often the same people say you're being highly insensitive to people in the who are are storm afflicted at the moment, and B, you could just put yourself in their shoes. Okay, but I mean, how about for voting? How can you be you're pro caucus because you're, let's say, a very progressive person who really preferred Bernie Sanders, and I have a feeling that a lot of the same people would say, but it's not that easy for evacuating, for saving your life. That's not easy, but for voting and determining the future of America and participating in democracy, that's supposed to be a snap. It's not. It's hours are hours. I sympathize with the beautiful theory of caucusing. If everybody could have their own little constitutional convention, it would be terrific. But it doesn't work that way. And people are going to get written out of the process that way. And, if you really want, I would think the Democratic and now the big Democratic Socialist revival, where are they? Do they have a platform on that? Do they care? I'm sure they don't want to meddle in they don't care about the Democratic Party fixing itself, clearly. But what do? They don't caucus, do they?
In theory, they should be against open primaries because the Green Party opposes open primaries, for example. Because if they're open primaries, then there's no Green Party.
I guess so. Yeah, they're subject to being overwhelmed. Why do we have a
ballot line for you if your people can vote in the Democratic primary?
Hey, this is complex.
Maybe I could vote in everybody's primary. Why can't I vote in everybody's primary?
I don't know. That's pretty open. All right. Well, there's certainly, lines have to be drawn somewhere. And, I don't object to saying as admirable as it is to try and, highlight involvement and persuasion in the process. It's not like there's no room for it. In primary states, they try to do that by knocking on your door, and in caucus states too. And there's time for persuasion, and it's better if everyone will gather in one place, but, it's also better if, whatever. We can wish for a fantastic president. Couldn't that person just be awesome and president? Well, no, you have to go through this process. If you can reach people, knock on their doors, and convince them, great. And then time runs out. The end. Sorry. That's just the way it is, even in a caucus. I could have won the caucus if I had just gotten 6 more of my neighbors out. Yeah, well, you didn't.
Yes. Yeah, I want to tell my Florida story, and then I'll let you go. I vote Florida. Florida,
yes,
during the primaries and during the election, has an extended early voting period. It's about 8 days.
Okay.
All right. You have to register as a Democrat 30 days before the final day of voting.
All right. 30 days.
The voting hours are 12 hours a day mostly. So basically, we're talking about, what is that, almost 100 hours of opportunity to vote. If we switch to an Iowa system, there'd be less precincts.
Yes.
One night, 2 hours to vote versus 100.
Yeah.
How can a Democrat in good conscience support that?
That is hard to do.
It's impossible.
I think so.
That's my final word. And I'll leave you back to your less echoey show.
This was much less echoey, I think, this last segment. Thanks a lot, Armando. We'll see whether people want to weigh in on this one, and I'm sure there will be more. But let's see. Culture of Truth says New Jersey should switch away from primaries just so they can have a caucus in Secaucus. And it certainly makes for makes a great pay-per-view event. The caucus in Secaucus. It's possible to do. They should do that in the Republic of Georgia, so they could have the caucus in the Caucasus or whatever the mountain range is there. It's very difficult to defend the caucus in the context of fighting voter suppression and in all its forms, in not just ID laws or restricting the number of voting machines, working voting machines that go to minority precincts, or the number of precincts that are established in minority areas. There's all kinds of voter suppression, some of it more benign than others, but honestly, the idea that we shouldn't, I guess I still stick by this. Yeah. How can you not engineer a process that gives the most people the most opportunity to express an interest? Yes, it's sad that it's reduced to, I don't know. I have like 5 minutes to make a decision. I'll check this box here. I voted, versus somebody who really goes and ponders what their neighbors have to say and weighs everything and comes to a conclusion. But, not everybody is interested in doing that. Not everybody is capable, I guess, of giving the time, certainly, of doing something like that. And some people are just, I've made up my mind, and actually I put some really solid reasoning into it. I just did it quickly, and I didn't consult with anybody else. And I might just be just as happy at the end with my decision, and you can't look into it that way. You can't weight participation that way and weight votes that way. The only people who are willing to prove to me, whoever I am, that I'm totally, that you're sufficiently dedicated to it. And the only way you can prove to me that you've sufficiently weighed your vote is to spend time on it. That's how I define a sufficiently weighed decision. And the only way you can prove to me that you've spent time on it is if you sit in this room and let me watch you spend time on it. That's the only way for me to verify how much, because you say you sat and pondered on it for 6 hours at home in a flotation tank, right? I don't believe you. Show me the flotation tank video or it didn't happen,
right? This way, this is obviously much easier. If I knock on your door to try to persuade you and you're in your isolation tank, you won't even hear me. I don't even get a chance to speak to you. So you have to come. I mean, imagine this, this is like basically the guy who, lost the race for local party chairman now says, I really miss having people listen to me speak. You all have to come and listen to me speak. Imagine if you reduced it to that. In order for your vote to count, you have to listen to me give you a speech for, 5 minutes, and then other people will be talking about things for 5 minutes too. So we all take turns. It's a very nice concept, but ultimately it's just a way of trying to formalize something that really honestly could and should be taking place beforehand anyway. And everybody knows that lots of it is taking place before a caucus anyhow. The only difference between a caucus and a primary with early voting and extended voting hours is 99% of the people who have something to say about this are shut out from coming to participate. I don't know. And I guess it almost feels like a waste of time at this point. As far as I can tell, there are no serious caucus backers listening to the show, pushing back and saying, yeah, but you're leaving this and that out. Although I'd love to hear from you about it, because surely there's something to it. Yes? Beyond the cost difference between a caucus and a primary, something really good. And tradition, because tradition doesn't seem to do it either. Not for me. Anyway, but it may be that the audience is just saying, okay, yeah, we get it. Caucuses are nice, but I don't want to do them. So maybe we've gone too far on this stuff. And maybe that's the best thing that could have come out of the discussion, because there was a lot of heated discussion about a lot of aspects of the way Democrats handle their primaries. And there definitely are problems, and they deserve more discussion. And maybe some of those things that deserve more discussion would have been super delegates, although I have some minor defenses to offer for super delegates, at least with respect to super delegates who are elected members of Congress or the governors, Democratic governors of their states. Those are people who are going to have to deal very directly with the person you nominate to be president, especially, of course, if they win the presidency. And it's important that they have a clear sense of who these people are. It would be nice if we trusted our members of Congress and other elected officials more, but that's sort of a different problem. So, okay, maybe there's some way that we can guarantee their involvement in the selection process without necessarily making them automatic voting delegates that are equivalent to people who campaigned for the job, but still, maybe they have some fraction of a vote. We have worked things like that out before. I have reason to believe that having superdelegates on hand is not necessarily a terrible thing, but that there are classes of superdelegates that we ought to clamp down on and or get rid of, and we can expand on those at a later date. Just as we will expand on other stories at a later date. In the meantime, for all your expansive story needs on this date, I recommend that you stay tuned to Netroots Radio right here. And if you're listening elsewhere, make your way over to Netroots Radio in order to listen in on the after show coming up next. What do they got for you? The United States Navy recovers the remains of all the sailors missing from the USS McCain collision. That is good news. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents stranded 50 immigrants, women and children, at an abandoned San Antonio, Texas bus station directly in the hurricane's path. Wow. And another wave of top State Department and cybersecurity officials quit in a Black Friday mass resignation. On the last half of the program coming up, they'll report that Trump taps a top Brexit strategist to help him roll out the Karl Rove playbook for mobilizing GOP voters. Ugh, just what we need.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thank you very much for listening. By the way, one more interesting story that they have here, a non-political one. Wine tasting, in fact, tasting wine, stimulates your brain more than math or any other human behavior. So let's all start drinking wine in the morning and wake ourselves up. That all coming up next on the After Show with Wink and Justice next.